The first glance. Arnold's life had been moving along like a well-oiled machine. He was a dedicated business consultant, working long hours, rarely indulging in much outside of his career. At 37, he had climbed to the top of his field, but it had come at a cost. His personal life was a wasteland of loneliness and failed relationships. That all changed when an accident during a business trip led to a severe injury, forcing Arnold into a long hospital stay. Isabel entered his life like a storm he didn't see coming. She was his nurse, and from the first moment she walked into his room, Arnold felt something shift inside him. Isabel was the type of woman who seemed to radiate warmth. With her long chestnut hair pulled back in a loose bun and her hazel eyes sparkling with an energy that felt rare in a hospital, she carried herself with a calm that put Arnold at ease. Isabel's touch was gentle as she checked his fore, her hands brushing his skin in ways that made him feel more than the usual patient-nurse connection. At first, Arnold thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He was vulnerable, after all. Lying helpless in a hospital bed for weeks had a way of distorting reality. But as the days passed, the subtle glances and longer-than-necessary smiles began to build tension between them. Isabel was married, of course. Arnold knew that from the gold ring she wore and the way she mentioned her husband in passing, Luke, a software engineer who worked long hours too. She described her marriage as comfortable, nothing more, nothing less. But Arnold saw the way her eyes dimmed when she talked about her home life, how she avoided discussing her husband in detail. At first, Arnold respected the boundaries. He tried to keep his thoughts in check, reminding himself that she was off-limits, that whatever spark he was feeling wasn't something he should entertain. But one night, during a late shift, everything changed. It was raining heavily outside, the soft patter of raindrops filling the quiet of the hospital room. Isabel had come in to check on him, but instead of the usual routine, she lingered. Arnold, half sitting up, watched her as she moved around the room, her movements slower, more deliberate. "You look tired," he said, his voice low, trying to break the silence between them. Isabel stopped and looked at him, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "Long day, but I'm fine. It's part of the job." Arnold nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. The air felt charged, and he couldn't help but ask, "Is it just the job? You seem distracted." Her smile faltered, and for a moment Arnold thought he had pushed too far. But then she sighed, coming closer to his bed, her hand lightly resting on the edge of the mattress. "Sometimes, I feel like I'm living someone else's life," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to think I had everything figured out, marriage, career, the perfect routine. But lately, I don't know. I feel like something's missing." Arnold's heart pounded in his chest as he listened. He didn't know if it was the pain medication dulling his usual restraint or if it was something more, but he reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. "You deserve more than just a routine," he said, his voice full of a sincerity he didn't expect. "You deserve to feel alive." Isabel looked at him, her breath hitching slightly as their eyes met. For a long moment they stayed like that, silent, the electricity between them almost visible. Then, without warning, she pulled her hand away, her face flushing with a mix of guilt and confusion. "I should go," she said quickly, stepping back. I can't do this." Arnold watched her leave the room, his heart sinking as the door clicked shut behind her. He knew he had crossed a line, but deep down, he didn't regret it. Something had shifted between them, and he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. He could see it in her eyes too. She was fighting it, but the attraction was there. The following days were tense. Isabel avoided being alone with Arnold whenever possible, sending other nurses in to handle the routine checkups. But when she did come, the air between them was thick with unspoken words, the tension building with each passing moment. Arnold felt the weight of his actions, but the desire that simmered beneath the surface refused to die down. Every time she was near, he wanted more. One night, it all came to a head. Arnold had been discharged earlier that day, but he was struggling with recovery at home. His back injury still required regular therapy sessions, and the hospital had sent someone to check on him. Isabel. It was her job, after all. The visit was supposed to be brief, just a quick follow-up. But when she showed up at his door, soaking wet from the rain, something snapped. "Come inside," Arnold said, his voice soft but firm. "You're drenched." Isabel hesitated, but she stepped inside, shaking the rain from her hair. She avoided his gaze as he handed her a towel, her body tense with unspoken tension. Arnold could feel the electricity in the air between them, the pull that neither of them had been able to shake since that night in the hospital. "I shouldn't be here," Isabel said, her voice shaky as she wiped her face with the towel. "But you are," Arnold replied, his voice low. "You could have sent someone else, but you didn't." Isabel froze, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, she looked like she was about to argue, to deny what was happening between them. But then, without another word, she dropped the towel and crossed the space between them, her lips crashing into his in a kiss that was equal parts passion and desperation. It was like a dam breaking. All the tension that had been building for weeks exploded in that moment, and before Arnold knew it, they were tangled together, their hands roaming each other's bodies, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The world outside ceased to exist as they gave in to the desire that had been gnawing at them both. Hours later, as they lay tangled in the sheets, the weight of what they had done hung heavy in the air. Isabel was silent, her back turned to Arnold as she stared at the rain-soaked window. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Arnold didn't know how to respond. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to tell her that it didn't have to end, but the reality of their situation was sinking in. She was married, and whatever they had just shared was fleeting, fragile, built on secrets and lies. "I know," Arnold said finally, his voice low. Isabel stood up, quickly dressing without looking at him. "I have to go. I'll call you tomorrow about the therapy session." Arnold watched her leave, the door clicking shut behind her once again. But this time it felt different. This time there was no going back. What had started as a forbidden connection had now turned into something far more dangerous. And deep down, Arnold knew that the consequences of their actions were just beginning to unfold. The spiral of secrets. Days passed, but neither Arnold nor Isabel could bring themselves to talk about what had happened between them. Isabel returned to her routine at the hospital, doing her best to act like everything was normal. But deep down, she was drowning in guilt. She had crossed a line, not only with Arnold but with herself. The betrayal weighed heavy on her, a secret she knew she could never share with her husband, Luke. At home, Luke noticed something was different. He was perceptive, even if he didn't always show it. Isabel had grown distant, her smiles less frequent, her conversations with him brief and forced. Luke's job kept him busy, but there was a growing tension between them, an unspoken rift widening with every passing day. Isabel hated herself for it, but the more she tried to put things right, the more she found herself thinking about Arnold. That night had unleashed something in her, something she had tried to keep buried for years, a desire for excitement, for passion, for escape from her suffocating life. As for Arnold, the affair with Isabel haunted him. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she had looked at him, the way she had kissed him, the way she had made him feel alive in ways he hadn't felt in years. He had never been the kind of man to get involved with a married woman, but this was different. Or at least he had convinced himself it was. The silence between them after their night together was unbearable. He wanted to reach out to her, to say something, anything, but he didn't know how. The breaking point came a week later when Isabel texted Arnold, asking him to meet at a secluded cafe on the edge of town. She couldn't stay away any longer, and neither could he. When Arnold arrived, Isabel was already there, sitting in the corner, her eyes red and puffy as if she had been crying. Arnold's stomach twisted with guilt as he sat down across from her. The cafe was quiet, the soft murmur of other patrons blending into the background as the two of them faced each other, the weight of their secret hanging in the air. "I can't keep doing this, Arnold," Isabel said quietly, her voice barely audible. "It's tearing me apart." Arnold leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know, Isabel, but you feel it too, don't you? This thing between us. We can't just pretend it didn't happen." Isabel's eyes filled with tears as she looked away, her hands trembling slightly. I know, but I have a husband. I have a life. I don't know how to stop this. We don't have to stop, Arnold whispered, reaching across the table to take her hand. We can figure it out. Together. For a moment, Isabel allowed herself to hold his hand, her thumb brushing gently against his skin. But then, just as quickly, she pulled away, shaking her head. No, she said firmly, her voice thick with emotion. We can't. Arnold, this is wrong. I'm not that kind of person. I can't be. Arnold wanted to argue, wanted to convince her that what they had was worth the risk. But deep down, he knew she was right. Their affair was built on lies, and no matter how much they tried to rationalize it, the reality of her marriage loomed over them like a shadow. I'm sorry, Isabel whispered, standing up abruptly. I can't do this anymore. She walked out of the cafe without looking back, leaving Arnold sitting there, the emptiness of her absence filling the room. He watched her disappear into the street, and something inside him snapped. He had thought he could handle the situation, that he could control his emotions, but now he realized he was losing everything. His feelings for Isabel weren't just a passing fling. They were something deeper, something more dangerous. Arnold spent the following days in a daze. He couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except Isabel. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart leaped, hoping it was her. But the silence dragged on. Isabel was gone, or at least she was trying to be. But fate had other plans. One evening, Arnold was at home, nursing a drink and trying to push Isabel out of his mind, when there was a knock at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment he considered ignoring it. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. Sighing, he set down his glass and opened the door. Standing there, drenched from the pouring rain, was Claire, Isabel's best friend. Arnold stared at her, confused and caught off guard. He hadn't seen Claire in months. Not since a casual dinner party where Isabel had introduced them. She was vivacious, funny, and full of energy. So different from the guilt-ridden Isabel he had been entangled with. But seeing her now, with her hair plastered to her face and her clothes soaked, she looked anything but her usual self. Claire, Arnold asked, his brow furrowed. What are you doing here? Claire didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped inside, her eyes flashing with something Arnold couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, it was more like desperation. We need to talk, she said, her voice firm but unsteady. Arnold, still reeling from the surprise, closed the door and gestured toward the living room. Claire followed him, her movements tense, as if she were holding something back. She stood in the middle of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and Arnold could see the conflict on her face. I know about you and Isabel, Claire said suddenly, her words cutting through the air like a knife. Arnold froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. What? You heard me? Claire continued, her eyes narrowing. Isabel told me everything. About the hospital. About that night. About all of it. Arnold's throat went dry, panic surging through him. Isabel had told Claire? His mind raced. Had she told Luke? Was this some kind of setup? I don't know what to say, Arnold stammered, feeling the walls closing in. Claire's eyes softened for a moment, and then, without warning, she stepped closer. I didn't come here to fight, Arnold. I came here because... She paused, her voice trembling. Because I've been thinking about you, ever since Isabel told me. And now, I can't stop. Arnold blinked, his confusion deepening. Claire, what are you talking about? I know it sounds crazy, Claire said, her voice growing more urgent. But when Isabel told me about you, I felt jealous. And now I can't get you out of my head. I don't know what to do, but I had to come here and see you. Arnold's mind was spinning. Claire? Isabel's best friend? This wasn't happening. But the look in Claire's eyes told him that it was all too real. She had crossed a line just like Isabel had. And now, standing in front of him, she was asking him to make a decision. I don't want to hurt her, Arnold said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is already a mess. But Claire stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. I don't care, she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. I need this. I need you. And just like that, the floodgates opened. The weeks that followed were a blur of tangled sheets and stolen moments. Claire had become an unexpected addiction. Her energy and reckless abandon, a stark contrast to Isabel's guilt and hesitation. It was wrong, Arnold knew that. But after everything, he didn't care. He was too deep into the web of lies to pull himself out now. But what Arnold didn't know was that the secrets were about to catch up with him in ways he could never have imagined. Because one morning, Claire showed up at his door, her face pale, her hands trembling. And this time, it wasn't desire that brought her there. It was something much bigger. I'm pregnant, she whispered, her voice shaking. It's yours. Arnold's world tilted, the ground slipping out from under him. The unraveling. Arnold stared at Claire, his heart pounding in his chest. Her words hung in the air, suffocating him. Pregnant? His mind couldn't catch up with the gravity of what she had just said. It felt like the room was closing in, the walls tightening around him, and the weight of his decisions crashing down all at once. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth was dry, and a knot formed in his stomach. Claire stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. She wasn't the carefree, daring woman he had been secretly seeing for the past few weeks. Now she looked vulnerable, scared of what this meant for both of them. Arnold finally managed to choke out, Are you sure? Claire nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I've taken 2 tests. I went to the doctor to confirm it. She placed a trembling hand on her stomach. It's real, Arnold. And it's yours. A whirlwind of emotions swirled inside Arnold. Panic, regret, guilt. His affair with Claire had been reckless, fueled by anger and the desire for revenge against Isabel. But this was a whole new level of complication. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't planned for this. What are we going to do? Claire's voice broke through the storm in his mind. Arnold sank into the couch, his hands covering his face as he tried to think. What were they going to do? He had no answers. He wasn't ready to be a father, and certainly not like this. Not with Claire, Isabel's best friend, in the middle of an affair that could destroy everything. I don't know, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire sat down beside him, but the closeness that had once been thrilling now felt heavy and suffocating. They were both lost in the maze they had created, and there was no clear way out. Meanwhile, Isabel's life was spiraling in her own way. She had thrown herself back into work, hoping that the busy schedule would keep her mind off the guilt that gnawed at her every waking moment. She had told herself that ending things with Arnold was the right decision, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about him. The connection they had shared, the way he had made her feel alive, it haunted her. But what haunted her more was the growing distance between her and Luke. Her husband had become a ghost in their home, always working late, barely speaking to her. Isabel tried to bridge the gap, cooking his favorite meals, asking about his day, but the conversations were stilted, awkward. Luke seemed distracted, and Isabel began to wonder if he sensed what she had done, if he somehow knew about her affair with Arnold. One evening, after another painfully quiet dinner, Isabel confronted him. Luke, we need to talk, she said, her voice tight with frustration. Luke glanced up from his phone, clearly caught off guard. About what? About us, Isabel said, her heart pounding. About why you've been so distant lately. Luke blinked, then sighed, setting his phone down on the table. I've been busy with work, Isabel. You know that. That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it. Isabel shot back, her anger bubbling to the surface. You've been pulling away for months. You barely talk to me anymore. You're never home. Luke hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Are you sure it's just me that's been distant? Or maybe there's something else going on here? Isabel's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. Was he accusing her? Did he know? What are you saying? She asked carefully. Luke leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. I don't know, Isabel. You tell me. You've been different lately. Distracted. Secretive. His eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. Is there something you want to confess? Isabel's pulse raced as she stared at him, fear and guilt twisting inside her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind screamed at her to tell him the truth, to confess everything and end the charade, but she couldn't. The shame was too great, and the fear of losing everything held her back. Instead, she shook her head, forcing herself to meet his gaze. There's nothing to confess, Luke. Luke studied her for a long moment, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. Okay, Isabel, if you say so, but the damage was done. The doubt had been planted, and Isabel knew that things between them would never be the same. The tension in Arnold's life reached a boiling point a few days later when he received an unexpected phone call from Isabel. His heart raced as her name flashed across the screen. He hadn't spoken to her since she ended things, and now, hearing her voice brought back all the emotions he had tried to bury. Arnold, she began, her voice soft but shaky. I don't know why I'm calling, but I can't stop thinking about you. Arnold leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He knew he should hang up, that talking to Isabel would only make things worse, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. I can't stop thinking about you either, he admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of their shared guilt. There was a long pause on the other end, and when Isabel spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. I miss you. I tried to forget, but I miss you. Arnold felt a pang in his chest, his heart twisting with longing and regret. I miss you too, he whispered. I don't know what to do, Arnold. Isabel continued, her voice breaking. Everything is falling apart. Luke and I, it's like we're living separate lives, and I can't stop thinking about what we had. Arnold's throat tightened. He knew exactly how she felt. We can't keep doing this, Isabel. It's tearing us both apart. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I need to see you. Just one more time. Please. Arnold's mind screamed at him to say no, to end it once and for all. But his heart betrayed him. He couldn't resist her pull, not after everything they had been through. Okay, he said, his voice shaky. One last time. The meeting was supposed to be their final goodbye, a chance for closure. But when Isabel walked into Arnold's apartment, the tension between them reignited in an instant. They tried to talk, to explain their feelings, but the conversation quickly dissolved into desperate kisses and tangled limbs. Their need for each other had taken over once again, and in that moment, neither of them cared about the consequences. Afterward, as they lay together in the aftermath of their reckless decision, Isabel's phone buzzed on the bedside table. She glanced at the screen, her face paling as she saw the name flashing across it. Claire. Arnold tensed, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been avoiding Claire ever since she told him about the pregnancy, not knowing how to deal with the situation. But now, seeing her name on Isabel's phone made his blood run cold. What is it? He asked, his voice tight. Isabel frowned, sitting up and answering the call. Claire? What's going on? Arnold watched as Isabel's face changed, her expression shifting from confusion to shock, and then to horror. No, Isabel whispered, her voice trembling. Claire, that can't be true. Please, tell me that's not true. Arnold's stomach twisted with dread. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. When Isabel hung up the phone, she turned to Arnold, her face ashen. Claire just told me she's pregnant, and it's yours. Arnold's world shattered in that moment. The truth, the lies, everything he had been trying to juggle came crashing down around him. Isabel stared at him, her eyes wide with betrayal and disbelief. You slept with my best friend? Isabel's voice was shaking with a mix of rage and devastation. And now she's pregnant? Arnold, how could you? Arnold tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was sit there, frozen in the aftermath of his own destruction. Isabel stood up, her body trembling with anger. "You've ruined everything. We've ruined everything." And with that, she stormed out, leaving Arnold alone in the wreckage of his own making. The lies had caught up to him, and now there was no escape. Confrontations and consequences. Arnold sat in the suffocating silence of his apartment, the words "she's pregnant," and "it's yours" echoing in his mind. The fallout from the revelation felt like a boulder crushing his chest. He had known things were spinning out of control, but now the reality of the mess he had created felt all too real. Isabel's storming exit had left the room thick with a sense of finality, a sense that nothing could ever be repaired. But that wasn't the end of it. For days, Arnold avoided answering calls or texts. Claire tried to reach out, desperate for a response, but Arnold couldn't bring himself to face her. Not yet. He wasn't sure how to deal with it all. The affair, the pregnancy, and the impending collapse of everything he'd known. The silence from Isabel was even worse. He had ruined things beyond repair with her, and no amount of explanations or apologies would fix that. On the 5th day, Claire showed up at Arnold's door. He opened it to find her standing there, visibly distraught. Her eyes were red from crying, and her usually confident demeanor had been replaced with vulnerability. "Arnold," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We need to talk. I can't keep doing this. We need to figure out what we're going to do." Arnold stepped aside, letting her in. He could feel the tension between them, like a bomb waiting to go off. Claire sat down on the couch, wringing her hands together, and Arnold remained standing, unsure of how to start. "I didn't expect things to go this far," Arnold began, his voice shaky. "I didn't expect any of this." "I didn't either," Claire replied, her voice breaking. "But here we are. I'm pregnant, and I don't know what to do." The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. Arnold couldn't deny his responsibility, but everything inside him screamed for escape. He wasn't ready to be a father, especially not in the middle of this chaotic love triangle. The affair with Claire had been born out of anger and frustration, an impulsive decision meant to fill the void Isabel had left behind. But now that impulse had led them here to this impossible situation. "Have you thought about your options?" Arnold asked hesitantly, not sure if he was stepping into dangerous territory. Claire looked up at him, a mixture of sadness and frustration flashing in her eyes. "I've thought about everything, Arnold. But this isn't just a decision I can make alone. This is your child too." The words "your child" hit Arnold like a punch to the gut. He hadn't allowed himself to think of the pregnancy in those terms, but there was no denying it anymore. Claire was carrying his baby, and whether he liked it or not, he was a part of this. "I'm not ready for this," Arnold said, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to be a father." "Neither do I," Claire said softly. "But we don't have a choice. This is happening." Arnold sat down across from her, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't know how to move forward. Isabel would never forgive him, and now Claire, Isabel's best friend, was in the middle of it all. The web of lies had finally caught up with him, and the consequences were unavoidable. "I'm sorry, Claire," Arnold said, his voice thick with guilt. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was angry at Isabel, at myself. I wasn't thinking clearly." Claire nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know. I was angry too. I was jealous of what Isabel had with you, and I let my emotions get the best of me." The room fell into silence once more, both of them sitting there, consumed by the consequences of their actions. Arnold felt a surge of guilt and regret, but there was no undoing what had been done. They had crossed too many lines, and now they had to face the aftermath together. "I'll be there for the baby," Arnold said finally, his voice steadying as he made the commitment. "I don't know how, but I won't abandon you. I'll do the right thing." Claire wiped away her tears, nodding. That's all I needed to hear. While Arnold grappled with his new reality, Isabel was on a collision course of her own. She had tried to keep herself together after the shocking phone call from Claire, but the betrayal cut too deep. Arnold hadn't just cheated on her. He had slept with her best friend, and now there was a child involved. Every time Isabel thought about it, a fresh wave of anger and sadness crashed over her. She felt like a fool, trapped in a web of deceit she hadn't seen coming. And yet, she couldn't completely blame Arnold. Deep down, Isabel knew she had pushed him away. She had been the one who broke the rules first, crossing the line by starting the affair with him. But that didn't make his betrayal any easier to swallow. One evening, after days of battling her emotions, Isabel decided she needed answers. She needed to confront Claire. She dialed her number with trembling hands, not sure what she would say, but determined to face the truth. When Claire answered, her voice was thick with tension. "Isabel, I didn't expect you to call. We need to talk," Isabel said coldly. "Face to face." There was a long pause on the other end before Claire sighed. "Okay, where?" They met at a park not far from where they had grown up, a place filled with memories of their childhood friendship. But now, the atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with unspoken words. Isabel stood by the fountain, her arms crossed as she waited for Claire to arrive. When Claire finally appeared, she looked anxious, her usual confidence shaken. They stared at each other for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging in the balance. "I never meant for this to happen," Claire said, breaking the silence. "I didn't plan any of it." Isabel's eyes narrowed, her heart pounding with anger. "But it did happen. You slept with him, Claire. You betrayed me, and now you're carrying his child." Claire's face crumpled with emotion, tears filling her eyes. "I know I hurt you, Isabel. I know I ruined everything. But I didn't go into this trying to steal him from you. It just happened." Isabel let out a bitter laugh. "It just happened? That's your excuse." "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Claire cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "I was lonely, I was jealous, and I acted out. I know it's no excuse, but I never wanted to hurt you." Isabel stared at her best friend, a mix of anger and sorrow flooding her chest. She had known Claire for years, trusted her with everything, and now this was the ultimate betrayal. But as much as she wanted to lash out, to scream and cry, a part of her couldn't help but feel responsible too. After all, it was her affair with Arnold that had set everything in motion. "I don't know what to do," Isabel said quietly, her voice trembling. "I feel like my entire world has collapsed. My marriage is falling apart. My relationship with Arnold is in ruins. And now you, Claire." Claire stepped closer, her eyes pleading. "I'm so sorry, Isabel. I'll do anything to fix this. But I'm having this baby, and I can't change that." Isabel closed her eyes, the weight of everything crashing down on her. There was no fixing this. The lies, the betrayal, the broken trust. It was all too much. But she also knew that holding onto the anger would only destroy her further. She needed to find a way to move forward, even if it meant letting go of the people she had once trusted most. "You and Arnold, you can have each other," Isabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm done. I'm done with both of you." Claire's face fell, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Isabel, please." But Isabel turned and walked away, her heart heavy but resolute. She couldn't fix what had been broken, but she could walk away from it. And that, she realized, was the first step toward healing. As Isabel left the park, she felt the weight of the past lifting, even if just a little. The pain was still there, but now she was ready to start over. Ready to reclaim her life, even if it meant doing it alone. Rebuilding from ruins. Months passed, but the weight of betrayal lingered over all their lives. The web of deceit, lies, and broken promises left scars that would never fully heal. But time, as always, moved forward. Life demanded it. Arnold had done his best to settle into his new reality. The shock of Claire's pregnancy had gradually given way to responsibility. The initial panic had subsided, replaced by a reluctant acceptance of the future he never saw coming. He couldn't change what had happened, but he was determined not to run from it either. Claire, despite the mess they had created, leaned on Arnold for support as her pregnancy progressed. Their affair had started in a whirlwind of impulse, revenge, and desire, but now they were tethered together by something far more permanent, a child. Yet, despite their growing connection, something felt hollow. They were bound together by circumstances, not love, and Arnold couldn't shake the emptiness that gnawed at him. The affair with Claire had been thrilling at first, but now it felt more like a burden, a reminder of everything he had lost. Their relationship had become one of necessity, not passion. They met for doctor's appointments, discussed plans for the baby, and spent time together. But there was no joy in it. The laughter, the spark, the sense of adventure, they were all gone. What remained was the uncomfortable reality of two people trapped by their mistakes, trying to do the right thing for a child who would soon arrive. Meanwhile, Isabel had gone through her own transformation. After walking away from both Arnold and Claire, she had been left shattered, lost and unsure of who she was without the two people she had once trusted most. But in the wreckage, Isabel found something she hadn't anticipated, herself. At first, the pain was unbearable. Luke had filed for divorce soon after discovering the full extent of Isabel's affair, and Isabel couldn't blame him. She hadn't expected him to stay, not after everything. The divorce was amicable but painful, and Luke's absence in her life left a gaping hole that she hadn't anticipated. Still, it was her decision to own her mistakes and start over that began to rebuild her from the inside out. Isabel took a leave from the hospital, needing time away from everything familiar. She spent weeks in solitude, reflecting on her choices, her desires, and the life she had lived. In those quiet moments, she realized that her affair with Arnold hadn't just been a reckless decision. It had been a symptom of a deeper problem. She had been unhappy in her marriage for a long time, suffocated by the routine and the predictability of her life. Arnold had been an escape, a way to feel alive again, but it was never about him. It was about her. With that realization, Isabel began to focus on healing. She started therapy, rebuilt her relationships with her family, and even found solace in her work. The distance from Arnold and Claire allowed her to finally see things clearly. She had been seeking fulfillment in all the wrong places. Now, she was ready to rebuild her life, not as someone's wife, not as someone's mistress, but as Isabel. The day Claire gave birth was bittersweet. Arnold stood by her side in the delivery room, holding her hand as she brought their child into the world. A baby girl with Claire's bright eyes and Arnold's dark hair. The moment he saw his daughter, Arnold felt something he hadn't expected. Love. It hit him like a wave, washing away all the bitterness and regret that had consumed him for so long. Holding his child in his arms, Arnold realized that, despite everything, this was something real, something pure and untangled by lies. Claire, too, was overcome with emotion, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They would be co-parents, connected by their daughter, but they weren't meant to be together in any other way. The affair had been born out of something toxic, and though they had tried to make it work for the sake of the baby, they both knew the truth. They couldn't force a relationship where there was no love, only obligation. After the birth, Arnold and Claire sat together in the hospital room, watching their baby girl sleep in the bassinet beside them. Claire looked over at Arnold, her eyes soft with exhaustion and emotion. "I don't regret our daughter," Claire said quietly, "but I think we both know this, it isn't right." Arnold nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing." They shared a moment of quiet understanding. Their relationship hadn't been built to last, but it had given them something precious, something worth fighting for. They agreed to co-parent their daughter, to support each other, but they would go their separate ways when it came to anything beyond that. It was the only way to move forward without causing more pain. Months later, Isabel stood on the balcony of her new apartment, sipping coffee as the sun set over the city. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Her divorce from Luke had been finalized, and she had come to terms with her mistakes. She wasn't running from them anymore. She had found new meaning in her work, developed new friendships, and even began to explore parts of herself she had long ignored. One afternoon, as she was walking through the city, Isabel spotted Arnold from a distance. He was pushing a stroller, his face lit up with a quiet smile as he spoke to the baby inside. Isabel felt a pang of something, maybe regret, maybe nostalgia. But she didn't approach him. She stood back, watching for a moment as Arnold, the man who had once consumed her thoughts, now looked at peace with his new role as a father. They hadn't spoken since that fateful day in his apartment, and Isabel had no intention of reopening old wounds. But seeing him now, happy and engaged with his daughter, she felt a sense of closure. Arnold had found his path, and she had found hers. As time went on, the wounds of the past began to heal. Arnold and Claire worked together to raise their daughter, navigating the complexities of co-parenting with care and respect. It wasn't always easy, but they made it work, putting their child's happiness above all else. Isabel, on the other hand, continued to rebuild her life from the ground up. She had learned the hard way that fulfillment couldn't be found in other people. It had to come from within, and she was finally ready to live her life on her own terms. The past, with all its lies and betrayal, was behind them now. What remained was the future. Unpredictable, yes, but full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, they were all ready to face it. Isabel smiled as she sipped her coffee, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. Life hadn't turned out the way she had planned, but it had brought her to a place of peace, of clarity. And that, she realized, was all she needed.